I also think that it means that you have to make sure that you have the law-abiding Muslim population of Europe on the side of liberal democracy, and by claiming that Islam per se is the problem, you alienate the very people you need to isolate the violent revolutionary element. But the violent revolutionary element is certainly there and does need to be taken seriously. To understand their mentality, I believe it doesn't help very much to read the Quran. I think it helps more to read Joseph Conrad on anarchists in the early 20th century, the anonymous man, angry with the world, walking around London with a ticking time bomb in his pocket, wanting to bring the world down, in which he feels is against him. It's a common psychology of young people who've lost their way. But if we leave the revolutionary element aside for a minute, which I think is a police problem, it's a problem of intelligence, of police work, and so on. Violence cannot be tolerated, you deal with that as a political and social issue, and not as a theological one. But what about if values do clash? Which is possible, that people have certain religious values which really clash to such an extent with the values of their fellow citizens that it does affect life adversely in a liberal democracy. And I would, perhaps a little provocatively, but since we are here to have a debate, I would use an example from the biography of Tariq Ramadan himself to clear this issue up, if nothing else, because I think it's a very important and interesting one. I can't remember the year. It was not. In 2003, the then Home Minister, Nicolas Sarkozy, put Tariq Ramadan on the spot on television in France by saying to him, are you not against the stoning of adulterous women? And Tariq Ramadan answered, well, and please correct me if I'm paraphrasing you wrongly, but I think what you said was, I'm personally against the death penalty anywhere, whether it's in the United States or Saudi Arabia. I personally, therefore, would wish to have a moratorium on such practices. But since these things are based on religious laws, it should be sorted out amongst religious people before you can actually simply say it should be banned, because by simply declaring a ban, you put yourself outside of a religious discussion. Is that more or less the view? And Sarkozy thought this was an outrageous way to dodge the issue. It was doublespeak. It was slipping away from an essential question, and so on. And again, I would quote Olivier Roy, because I think he had a very interesting take on this. And I still haven't quite made up my mind to what extent I think he's entirely right, but I think it's an interpretation which I think is worth pondering and taking seriously. He said, well, it doesn't sound very clear. It sounds wishy-washy perhaps, but what Ramadan is really doing is de facto separating church from state in this statement by saying that you have the secular laws, there are laws in a secular society, and then there are religious rules, and you don't mix them up. And so it's one step towards, indeed, a separation of society, which most of us would agree is necessary. Now, the question is, because another statement Tariq Ramadan has once made is that he encourages fellow Muslims to support the democracies of which they are citizens, as long as they allow them to live according to their Muslim faith. Now, what happens, and maybe it doesn't happen, but what happens in cases where the secular laws are in direct conflict with the religious laws? Which should then prevail? And I think that Sarkozy, in his sort of bullying, ham-fisted way, was perhaps asking that question. That if they clash, then which should prevail if you're a citizen of a liberal democracy? In my view, religious law should then always give way to secular law. But this is something that perhaps we can argue about, and I think already passed my allotted time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. And as it was said, in fact, I'm just coming from the States. I'm going to Canada tomorrow. So I came here following a promise because you asked me to come. It was a long time ago, and I said yes. And out of respect towards Jan Buruma, I respect your work. I respect the critical debates that we had and still have, and out also of respect to my words. I'm here. Unfortunately, I have to leave quite soon after the debate, but we'll have time for that. So let me. I'm not going to respond to. I will refer to some of the points that you were making, but mainly it will come to the second one. Let me come to my understanding of the topic about us being Western, being European citizens or Western citizens and living together and trying to get to what I'm calling for, which is a new we for now and for the future. And by asking this question, also implicitly, quite explicitly asking the question of who is or who are the strangers, and in which way we have to deal with the issue. So, as it was said in your introduction, and then you yourself started with this, I think that we should acknowledge the fact, and the starting point is really to face the fears and the questions that we are experiencing within our societies. Not only in the West, by the way, in Muslim majority countries you have exactly the same problems when it comes to defining our identities, but I would say that we come to the West, and for me it's quite important to ask this question here, because as I wrote in one book, Western Muslims and the Future of Islam, our experience will have a tremendous impact on what is going on in Muslim majority countries. And we need to know this because it's a very serious responsibility, is in which way our discussion, if we are unable to talk among ourselves here, how are we going to talk about Muslim majority countries when it comes to values, principles, and our common future? But I would say that what we are experiencing really is double identity crisis, so to speak. In fact, if you look at what is happening in the West, in the United States of America, it is a question, and not only connected to Muslim, but also with anything which has to do with migrations and the Latinos and the African American. It's as if we are not really talking about it, but it is a question of identity. We have it in Europe, of course, and there is something which is, who are we in the global world? And this is why we are now talking about Dutchness, Britishness, Frenchness, and so forth and so on. I think that this is something which is reality. Now we come to deal with the Muslim communities in the West. And once again, it could be exactly the same in Muslim majority countries, but let us speak about our situation here. Is that we are facing an identity crisis. Who are we? What is going to be our future? Are we going to be assimilated? Are we going to be integrated? Are we going to be respected? Are we going only to be accepted? And what is the future? So we have a double identity crisis. And the problem is that when you are facing a crisis, the point is that you listen less and you talk much. Because you are reactive. Is that, why? This is Dutchness, this is us. And who is it? I'm defining myself to something which is the prism, or something which is a negative identity. Defining myself to who I am not. And very often is the case. It's very difficult to listen when yourself you are going through a psychological crisis. It's difficult when you are going through an identity crisis. And when you are in between the two walls and the universes of reference, this is exactly what you see. We don't listen to each other. It's very difficult. Not enough. And I would say that this is the starting point of what we have to acknowledge. The second thing is that the second point is that we are going to live together. Willing it or not, this is a fact. So to be perceived very often when we are dealing with this identity crisis as the outsider with it is exactly the way have been, I